Hello, it's David Willey again, and I'm here with another book review for you, something that you might like to order to keep you going in these rather difficult times. This is a book I'm going to by Mark Urban called The Tank War, and it's subtitled here, The British Band of Brothers, One Tank Regiment's World War II. Now, Mark Urban, you may know the name. He's a journalist for the BBC. He's on things like Panorama Newslight. He's a great author. He's written a number of books already. But he was also, early in his career, he was in the Royal Tank Regiment. And what he's done with this book is a number of things. And that's why I'm recommending it to you, because I know a lot of people have said, OK, so what was it like for the crews? How did they experience the war in a tank? And what Mark manages to do in this book is not only does he come up with a series of characters that served in the 5th Royal Tank Regiment that you follow through the Second World War campaign, and you can't help but get to like and get to know these characters and find out, you know, an interest in what happens to them. Not only has he got that lovely nitty-gritty detail, he's also looking at something that sometimes gets overlooked. You know, this idea of what are you belonging to, the idea of a regiment. And what does that really mean? What does it mean in terms of, is there a modern analogy? Is it about like a football team or a cricket team or whatever it is? And what he manages to do in this book, because he follows that regiment throughout the entire war, you get that sense of how they felt they were belonging. What changes happened through the regiment? And because the 5th Royal Tank, it starts off, it fights in North Africa, it goes to Italy, it's brought back to Britain, it goes across to Normandy and fights through right to the end of the war into Germany. And of course, just like any other sort of grouping of men, things change through that time. Soldiers come, soldiers go, people get promotions, people get demotions, as you'll see inside the book. There's changes in COs, which is again, something he brings out on. Who is that person in charge and how do they stamp their authority and their vision on a regiment, a fighting force, and how does that pan out in reality? And with the 5th Royal Tank Regiment, it's a cracking story, because not only do they see a huge amount of action, he's got some really good blokes to follow, including one whose name you may have heard of, Jake Wardrop, whose diaries amazingly survived the war, and which was presented to the Tank Museum just last year, a stunningly wonderful gift from the family. His diary has been published. He is just such an interesting character in so many ways. The diary is brilliant to read, heavily quoted in the Tank War, and it also, Jake himself, what's amazing, if you read his diary, you can see his version of events. But what Mark Urban's being able to do is put Jake in the context of his crew, his regiment, what other people thought of someone like Jake. And Jake, by the way, was an interesting character. There's so many interesting guys in this book, but because Jake was one of those ones that really was a character. He gets court-martialed at one point. He's off for a good old booze up. He's in the boxing team and he likes a good old punch up every now and again. He gets demoted. He's absolutely in it for the fight, and there is just such a stunningly moving letter at one point which he writes to his mother, which is basically that, just in case I wanted you to know this, Mum, which you can't help but read without choking up, because he's saying, look, I believe in the fight I'm involved in, I'm good at it, I need to be there, don't worry about me. You know, and it's just one of those amazing bits of literature. And so often, again, quoting from his diaries in Mark's book, is that sense that comes across of just these little details, and sometimes the bits of, you know, how he respects other crewmen, how he dislikes people, how in terms of what we would call bravery, they at the time were, you know, were they up for the fight? Who are the people that seem to be skulking off? And again, some of those, what you might call the ugly details, that is picked up on also in Mark's book, which he doesn't shy away from, the other side of life as being a soldier, all these young blokes out there, whether they're going off to get drunk, going off to find themselves a young lady somewhere, etc., etc. So that's all in this book, and it is really worth a read. And I come back to that sense of seeing the regiment as it goes through the war years with those different COs. And one of the big issues that this regiment faced is a CO that just didn't get on and didn't fit. and how, like it often happened throughout the militaries, how people got rid of in those awkward wartime circumstances. And at one point, a CO, just before the D-Day landings, they manage as a regiment, because he is so unpopular and he just doesn't get on with anybody, they manage to have him moved on, and a new CO comes into place. And they've been very lucky, because prior to this they've had some very well-respected commanding officers who, and again, people like Jake, you know, he comes out with about why they admire different men and why they would lead them, and what it is about leadership in battle that's important. But a new CO is appointed, and I just thought I'd read you this bit, because imagine this as the bloke who turns up as your new CO. The chap who's actually given the place is a guy called Gus Holliman. Holliman was just 26 when he took over 5th Royal Tank Regiment. I mean, just think of that a second. 26-year-old bloke takes command of a whole regiment. 26 when he does that. Tall and powerfully built, he conformed to the sportsman ideal of the tank officer, excelling at rugby and happily belting out centuries at cricket. Although commissioned into the Tank Corps in 1937, he had soon gravitated towards Special Forces and commanded probably the hardest men in the 8th Army, the Rhodesian section of the Long Range Desert Group. Returning to 1st Tanks as commander of A Squadron, it had been Holliman's Crusader that was knocked out by a Tiger on the outskirts of Tunis in May 1943. He had simply taken over another tank and carried on. He had twice been awarded the MC in the Middle East. So Holliman takes control, and there's photographs in here where you look at all these different characters, all their great names, but their faces you see there. And Holliman, Jake Wardrop respects him. He really sees this as a commander who's up for the fight, just like Jake Wardrop is. And he believes in him and how he's going to lead that regiment forward. So just like that idea of a football team, you know, the analogy, or cricket team, when you look at it over time, who was the manager, the CO, what influence they had, how that particular unit fought or that team played. Different players come in over the period. So, you know, were you there when this person was around? Because obviously it's something that moves on. And that is why, another reason I'd strongly recommend this book by Mark Urban there. And again, as we always go on about, yes, the tanks are wonderful, but actually it's all those personal stories that really bring the subject to life. Seeing what it was like to fight in those vehicles in the Second World War, and I kid you not, by the time you get to the end, you know, there's not a dry eye in the house where you find out what some of these, you know, not just some of the accounts, but what happens to some of the characters. And we're very pleased as well, because of course Jake Wardrop is one of the characters. He's mentioned in here, his diary's been published. He's one of the characters in our new World War II displays when they're going to open, that we particularly pick on, because we've got some lovely material from him, and he's a great guy for illustrating what it was like to be a British tank crewman in the Second World War. So I recommend that book to you. Again, please, if you are going to buy a copy, we've got it reduced in our shop. Do have a look on our online shop. And as I always say, if you buy it from the Tank Museum's online shop, that helps us as an independent charity keep going through these difficult times. So as ever, look after yourself, stay safe, keep watching our content, and maybe buy a book.